Good morning, everybody. So I'm taking the pro side. I know it gets a little bit confusing. That is that effective HACCP programs should negate the need for routine finished product testing. And I think everybody has heard the stories and the around the statistics and the problems with end product testing. And in fact, many years ago, it's amazing that I've been around the food industry this long, but when HACCP first originated, 30 years ago or so, the idea behind HACCP was that end product testing was really not efficient and effective for catching all the food safety risks. And that's really the reason that HACCP was developed. And my favorite analogy is this needle in a haystack idea. When we're looking for pathogens in finished product, it's like looking for the needle in the haystack. And when I Googled and looked for a picture, this is what I found. And it'd be nice if all the needles were that big, but they're not usually that big. So going kind of back to the statistics of sampling, this was a quote from Mark Powell, who's a really good food safety statistician. In general, when acceptable defect levels are very low, and typically the defect levels are very low. We just heard from Michelle about the very low levels of pathogens that were found in the sprout seeds. Lot acceptance sampling, and that means, hold and test basically. You're going to hold and test every lot of your finished product until you get the test result, is not cost effective as a direct quality control measure due to the extremely large sample sizes required to provide a high degree of confidence of detecting defects. And it always draws a chuckle, so I'm going to say it, but we would have to test 100% of the food to be 100% confident that we caught the pathogen. And then there wouldn't be anything left to eat. So, you're supposed to chuckle. So to kind of bring it home, when you look at the statistics, for a defect occurring in 1% of the samples, and that's actually a really high rate of positivity for a pathogen in a typical, especially like a dry ingredient. And assuming that it's evenly distributed, which is never the case. So even these statistics that look pretty bad are even worse in real life because the pathogens are not agreeing to be evenly distributed. One would need to sample 300 samples to have a 95% confidence of finding the defect. And I show a picture here of approximately 300 bags of dog food. This is actually 288 bags, if anybody's counting. But if you can imagine sticking a sterile trier into each one of these bags and pulling out 25 grams and taking it to the lab and grinding it all up and looking, that would just barely get you to a 95% confidence, assuming even distribution and assuming 1% contamination rate, and it's usually lower than that. So the reason that we're talking about this, I think, is that we're seeing the pendulum swinging a little bit. And I work for a company that makes lots of ingredients. And I think it's important to remember that my finished product is oftentimes your ingredient. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of the large consumer packaged goods companies especially are using more and more sophisticated risk assessment tools. They're plugging a lot of information into the computer, and it's coming out with a whole list of tests that should be done on their ingredients. And again, their ingredients are my finished products. And also there's a kind of a requirement or a wish to standardize the specification. And so it's really, in a lot of cases, taking a one-size-fits-all approach. So let's just test for a whole bunch of things in all of our ingredients to really cover all the bases, and then we'll be making a safer food product. And then we're seeing a lot of the smaller companies saying, oh, the big companies are doing that, so we should be doing that too. We're also, one of my favorite quotes is from my friend Bill Sperber. Food safety is not a computer game. It's really not good to just plug everything into a computer and have it spit out what you should be doing. It's a lot more complicated than that. Another thing that I think is driving a lot more testing is what I call physmophobia, and maybe I should trademark that. But a lot of people are anticipating that FDA is going to be requiring all this finished product testing, so let's go ahead and get ahead of the game and just start testing everything for everything. I really don't think that's what's going to end up in the final regulation, I'm hoping, because I know there's a lot of smart people in FDA that are working to make sure that the testing is risk-based. And so my plea on the pro side of this is really that we consider the risks, we consider all the ways that the products are going to be used, and not just have these blanket requirements for end product testing. So a lot of people say, well, what's the big deal about end product testing? A salmonella costs $30. I mean, you can test, why are you so afraid of spending $30 on a test? One of the big issues is the lack of lot segregation in low moisture ingredients. There's been a GMA task force, been working now for, 5 years or so, trying to figure out how we can segregate these lots of dry ingredients. Because we don't have a wet sanitation every night that provides that nice break point. So if somebody tests some of these products and finds a positive for an adulterant like salmonella, it can be a year's worth of production that's impacted because we are not able to prove exactly where that cutoff is between what's contaminated and what's not contaminated. There's also a risk of sampling or lab errors, and there's an over-reliance on the results in finished product testing. And probably the most costly thing to the food industry, which is then going to be costly to the consumer, is when there's adulterant testing of uncontrolled ingredients, leading to the potential for massive recalls with very little public health impact. But then you may say, but my lab is really good. We don't make mistakes. And so I thought these statistics from the American Proficiency Institute that were presented at ASM this past year were really interesting. By the way, if you Google shocked scientists, this is the emoticon that you get. So, they sampled 17,881 samples, so sent out to laboratories, and these are the good labs that participate in proficiency program. These labs are taking extra precautions. They're using their best technicians and doing everything in duplicate and triplicate to get the results because they know this is a check sample. And still, false positive rates, 2.1 to 5.9% false positive rates. False negative rates of 1.9 to 10.6% false negative rates. So that's why it's not a good thing to put too much reliance on those tests. So some better alternatives, emphasis on GMPs and HACCP. The place for testing is in environmental monitoring and verifying and validating critical limits and CCPs. I think it's much better to rely on audits and targeted visits, getting to know your suppliers, and then sharing critical information, things like who owns the kill step, what is the intended use, and what is the complete understanding of the supply chain. And when all these things are done, it should greatly negate the need for finished product testing. Thanks.
So I was asked to represent the con position. So the position is, despite effective HACCP systems, finished product testing is useful and is relevant in a food safety system. So I represent a producer, and as a producer, we have in place HACCP. We've had HACCP systems in our factories for quite a long time. But we do, as a producer, have a good knowledge of our own products and processes. We've done the HACCP studies, we've identified the control measures, and we know from day to day how those systems are managed. So we have intimate understanding of how those controls are working, how the environment is performing, the personnel practices. We have internal audits. We have verification and monitoring of control measures in our systems. So as a producer, I'm very close to the product and process, and having a preventive understanding of what I need to do to prevent issues and prevent foodborne illness organisms in my product. I have some confidence, even based upon my systems, that I can release the product. Nevertheless, I do use testing to verify if I have environmental controls, such as zoning controls around movement of people and materials. If I have cleaning controls around cleaning and sanitation, I will use hygiene testing and finished product testing, or pathogen testing, to evaluate and to test to verify the effectiveness of those controls. I may also use testing in my finished product. I may, in products that are exposed after my heat processing step, I may apply hygiene indicators to indicate, to give me an idea of whether or not recontamination is occurring in that product after processing, or whether or not my cleaning and sanitation systems actually worked. In some systems, such as aseptic products, I might use an ongoing sterility testing of my products to evaluate the performance, not only whether or not there's a catastrophic failure in the process, but whether or not I have a good ongoing performance of my line and I keep my defect rate low and don't end up with spoiled product on the market. I may also use finished product testing to verify conformance to performance objectives or product specifications. This could be on the request of one of my customers, food service operator or retailer, or if I'm producing a material that's being used by another food producer. I also will use finished product testing myself when I have other indications that there's some hygienic concern on the line. It might be elevated levels of a hygiene indicator. It may be that there was some maintenance event or some issue with roof leakage or some event that led to increased concern about the hygienic status of my line. It could also be that I do periodic testing. I might do periodic testing as well, just as a subset of the verification that I do of my product on a routine basis. So as a purchaser, when I'm purchasing raw materials, I'm working with another food producer, and I need to make sure, first of all, that my requirements are well stated in my specifications. Very importantly, I need to have on-site understanding of their product and process. So I will do qualification audits when I'm qualifying a new supplier. I need to understand the HACCP system, how it operates in the factory, how they manage their control measures, how they verify their systems. I may rely in third-party or third-party audits or GFSI certification audits. I do my own audits of those suppliers based upon risk, but that's really every 1 to 3 years, or maybe even greater than every 3 years, that I can get into my suppliers. I've got 2,000 suppliers, I've got 5,000 raw materials. There's only so many people that I can have on my team in order to be able to go and have on-site audits of the manufacturer. And there's some challenges there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So as verification, I may request for some materials a certificate of conformance. That's just them saying, yeah, we'll conform to your specification. We're telling you we're confident. But where we want additional confidence because of the risk of the material, we'll ask for a certificate of analysis, where we're asking the supplier to do their own testing and provide us a certificate of analysis demonstrating that that particular lot conformed to our specification requirements. We'll also, at some frequency, do verification testing of our own to make sure that that certificate of analysis is accurate, and to make sure that that nothing has changed in that system. So why would we conduct verification testing for raw materials and ingredients? Well, first of all, audits occur every 1 to 3 years or even longer. We have some suppliers we may be able to get into every 5 years. So we need to focus our audits based upon risk and history of the supplier. But even for those high-risk materials, we may only be able to get into the factory once a year. And all that we get really is a snapshot during the time we're in the factory, and we have a snapshot of what the team happened to look at the time they were in the facility. We don't have visibility into the ongoing production in the factory. We don't have visibility into whether or not issues occurred in their process. We only have visibility into what we see at the time of the audit. We also don't have an understanding of that lot suitability of that particular lot if we're just accepting a certificate of conformance, because we don't know if the supplier is not looking, we're not sure that their control measures are working consistently. So we typically, where we're relying on finished product testing, we're asking the supplier to provide a certificate of analysis. But we also, as I've said, we want to verify their certificate of analysis to make sure that 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 the certificate of analyses are accurate. In cases where suppliers may discontinue testing, there may be a case where they decide that testing is not important and they're providing a certificate of analysis on a lot other than the lot we're receiving. We also gives us ongoing evidence of the performance of the manufacturer and the product over time. So we can use that data in order to evaluate our supplier performance, and that feeds into the amount of time or the frequency with which we have to audit. So there's systems which allow us to determine not only our audit frequency, but also the raw material testing frequency based upon risk. And this is from a book on food safety management that was just issued. And it shows a basic decision tree for raw material testing. So basically, we're doing our HACCP study. We're doing our HACCP study. From the HACCP study, we need to determine whether or not that material it has a hazard, microbiological hazard that's reasonably likely to occur and must be controlled at the supplier. If there are no hazards, but the hazards can be introduced in handling and transportation, we may consider it low risk. If there's no hazards, there's no risk. If there are hazards, then we have to ask, can the supplier control the hazards? If the suppliers can't control the hazards, we have to say, do we have a control measure in-house in our own facility? And if we don't, then the raw material is not fit for purpose, so find a new raw material or implement a process. If the supplier does have a control measure, then we need to ask, do we anyway have a control measure? I don't need to test milk powder going into an aseptic process because I'm anyway going to eliminate the risk. There I might, so in that case I might test if it's necessary to determine the quality, but I don't really need to test based for safety. If they don't, if the supplier, so again, if the supplier doesn't, we have a control measure. We may test for quality or initial load prior to processing. If they do have a control measure and we're anyway testing, again, we don't need to rely on supplier testing. But if we don't have a control measure, the supplier can manage the control measure. We're asking whether or not there's factors in place that elevate the material risk. These could be issues such as the type of material and whether they're sprouts, or whether they're a dairy powder that may have salmonella issues, whether they're materials that due to the nature of the material has some concern, elevated concern. It could be that the product's consumed by an elevated population. It could be it's going into a product, a refrigerated product in which it can grow. In that case, we would call it a high-risk material, for example, or if those risk factors don't exist, then it would be medium risk. And then you can use that in order to determine your testing frequency. So if it's high risk, we may ask for a COA on each lot, but then we might do our own testing on each lot because we're so concerned. If it's a medium risk, we might ask for a COA. We might do some qualification testing and then just quarterly testing to verify the COA. Or if it's low risk, we may evaluate lesser lots and then test quarterly or biannually, frequency. So we have relationships with our suppliers. We understand how our suppliers operate, but we need an input of data to give us some confidence, ongoing confidence in our supplier and build that supplier confidence over time, because we know things change in any food producer, and we need to have a good picture of what's going on in that food producer over time. We have audits. Audits are important, but we can only audit with certain frequency, and then we only see what's going on at the time that we're auditing. So we feel that testing and presenting the testing is still important with HACCP systems in place, although HACCP can help us determine where and when testing is important.
So I think it's important to read the question, and we're saying it negates the need. We're not saying it totally eliminates. So actually, to feed into this, the earlier discussion, I think sprouts is a perfect case for 100% hold and test, where end product testing does make sense. So Cargill is a huge supplier to Nestle, so this is kind of like playing golf with your boss. So I really don't want to win this, but Tim did mention that one of the reasons for some of their end product or their requirements for ingredient testing is simply because they have so many suppliers, and it's impossible to to audit them often enough and so forth. And I would say, you should narrow down your number of suppliers. I mean, Cargill can supply almost everything, but I do think that that a lot of what Tim says, I totally agree with. That this end product testing and the determination of testing for ingredients really needs to be risk-based. And I do think they do a great job of understanding those risks. And I wish other people were as good as that, because we do have a lot of just blanket requirements to test everything for everything. And there's a lot of money spent on that. And like I said, if we find an adulterant in some of these dry ingredients that don't have any sanitary breakpoints, it can cost us millions of dollars. I mean, literally. Because we'd have to, that salt or that cornstarch or that wheat flour has been made into millions and millions of dollars worth of products. And if we have to recall that, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the industry. And is that really the best way to protect public health? It's just adding a lot of cost to the system. So again, we're not saying that nothing should be end product testing should be completely eliminated. It just should be minimized because of all the other controls that are in place.
Is this on? Okay. So I'm going to have our procurement people talk to you about contracts, whether we can get special pricing if we source from one supplier. I appreciate that you presented the statistics of sampling, and certainly you can sample a huge number of samples from a lot, and you still, where the level of contamination is low, there's still not a high confidence that you can detect that defective unit in that lot. And so where we would see testing is really giving us an indication of a catastrophic failure in a lot, because even though the probabilities are low, there are still cases where we find issues either through hygiene indicators, where we can have a conversation and say to our suppliers, something's going on, can you tell us what this means, what's your corrective action? We can have that discussion. Or sometimes we even find issues despite the statistics of sampling. Again, ideally, we'd like to be able to spend time with all of our suppliers and spend time on site to really understand what's going on with the suppliers, but that's just not possible with every supplier. So it really needs to be a basket of verification activities, including on-site audits. I wanted to talk about the laboratory proficiency, because this is certainly a question and a concern. And there it's an issue of making sure that the laboratories really do have the appropriate control measures, good laboratory practices in place, because if we can't, we do testing ourselves, and so we need to be able to rely on our testing for our own products to be able to be accurate and consistent. And we also need to, though, make sure that before we react to a result, we have a discussion about what that result means. So if I find salmonella in a material from my supplier, I need to be able to have that discussion, make sure that the laboratory has appropriate controls in place, make sure it's not their standard that they've contaminated the sample with, that it's a different strain. So that's really important. To the product on the market, I think I would throw out that I should not be concerned as a manufacturer for somebody to test my product on the market if my HACCP system is working, because I should have that confidence. Hopefully I have that confidence in that HACCP system. And if everything goes right, if the laboratory is a good laboratory and my systems are in place, then there should not be that concern.
Thank you.